Greetings and welcome to this chat about inclusive education. We invite someone to join us for each session and some individual who's doing some interesting things related to inclusive education in Canada, and hope that you welcome the opportunity to chat with us. I'm Gordon Porter, the Director of Inclusive Education Canada, and my colleagues are Diane Richler, who's chair of the Catalyst for Inclusive Education project of Inclusion International. And they do work on a global level to promote inclusive education. And Diane's a former executive vice president of what's now Inclusion Canada, used to be called the Canadian Association for Community Living. And our other colleague is Jackie Speck, who's chair of the Canadian Research Centre on Inclusive Education at Western University in London. And Jackie's a professor of education at Western University. Our guest today is Jess Whitley, who's a professor at University of Ottawa. And Jess has a variety of experiences related to education and special education and inclusive education. And we're going to chat with her about that today. A couple of things she's currently doing. She's conducting a review of the implementation of a new inclusive education policy in the province of Nova Scotia. And I'm particularly interested in that because I worked with them on developing the policy. So I'm quite interested to hear what she may be able to share about that. And secondly, she's right now finishing a set of guidelines for the Ontario Ministry of Education on how to provide distance education for students with learning difficulties or special needs. So those are just a couple of the things she's doing, and we welcome her to our session. And Jess, why don't you start by just telling us a little bit about how you come to be associated with this inclusion network that we now see among university people across the country.
Thanks, Gordon. Appreciate the invitation to chat. So network-wise, I'm thinking that some of the early mentors I had probably sparked my involvement with this kind of national focus that we have on inclusive education. When I did my master's 20 some years ago, it was with Nancy Heath at McGill University, and she really focused a lot on high quality research and rigor within the area of inclusive education. And then I was fortunate enough to work with with Judy Lupart at the University of Alberta. And she was such a strong proponent of inclusive education. And she had such remarkable connections and collaborative work and she introduced me through the Canadian Association for Educational Psychology to researchers and practitioners around the country and internationally. And that really is what sparked my involvement in this work in Canada in particular. So I had a couple of great mentors along the way.
So tell us a little bit about what you're doing in Nova Scotia and what you're learning from that experience in terms of implementing inclusive education in schools.
So this is a fairly recent, given that my background is in psychology, a lot of my work is focused on the individual child and student within inclusive education. And then work led by people like Jackie Speck really broadened that to thinking about the role of teachers in inclusive education. And then this most recent work with my colleague Andy Hargraves, who's a great systems thinker, is really looking at a whole province reform. And I know you know this work well, Gordon, and your involvement in the policy. So we're conducting a developmental evaluation of the implementation of the policy. So we're looking at, if you can imagine we couldn't even list the number of ways where, the Department of Education in Nova Scotia might be implementing a policy in dozens of different ways at one time, and then within the regions. And so it's really complex work. And our first year really focused on the very beginnings of the policy and how people were understanding the policy, which has really broadened the view of inclusive education to involve all communities and really thinking about all learners. So really getting a sense of what were people's perceptions and understandings about the inclusive education policy, and getting the perspectives of those who are in leadership roles. So those who are really working to plan the implementation. And now in the second year, we're just starting next week with, I think we got a little feedback there, but we're just starting next week with recruiting and interviewing students. So children, youth, families, who are the ones who are obviously the most impacted by whatever is happening in terms of inclusive education. So we're starting that whole second phase. So we're really excited to be able to get those voices which speak to how effective has the implementation of the policy been from the sort of end user. So that's the point where we're at right now in the evaluation.
Okay. Diane or Jackie, want to follow up on that?
From what I saw of the title of the research, you're talking about outcomes. So, you know, how detailed are you getting in terms of, and what's the focus of the outcomes that you're talking about? My knowledge of what's going on in Nova Scotia is very biased, hearing from families who are having real trouble with the system and whose kids are, I mean, they're registered, they go to school, but their experience is not what one would hope for. I mean, I have a biased sample because I tend to hear from people who are having problems. So I'm just wondering if you can give any indication of you know, what are you hoping to find out? And you know, I'm hoping that my experiences are not the norm.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, because I you know, in most of my research, I was thinking about that last week, that when I put out a call for interviews or participants for various studies, it is quite common to hear from people who are really struggling within the system. So I do find that I spend a lot of time hearing about concerns as well, which is valid, obviously. In the Nova Scotia work, what's kind of interesting about this evaluation is that we are evaluating the implementation of the policy as opposed to evaluating the policy and its impact on students. So we're trying to get a sense of how well is it working in terms of taking this policy and putting in place activities, professional learning, aligning it with African Nova Scotian frameworks, all the alignment piece, the cohesion piece, putting all of that together and bringing it to the system. And is that translating? Is the policy actually coming to life? Are people understanding the policy in the ways that it was intended when it was actually developed? So in terms of gathering the voices of those who would be people that you would know well, through them, we would hope to get a sense of what are they seeing? Are they seeing any changes? What are they seeing and hearing, where we could work backwards to say, okay, you thought this was coming through clearly. Families are saying, well, this is what I saw yesterday. This is how we're experiencing it. So there's a disconnect there, right? And so that's where we'll work with the department to say, here's where you need to put some attention and some focus. This is where you think is happening, but somewhere along the way, that's not the way it's panning out, given that it's only like year 2 of implementation. It's an ongoing. So that's what some of that can allow us to tell. But the whole goal is to just constantly be feeding back to the department, not at the end to say, well, you did a great job of this or you didn't, but to say, here's what we saw this week. Here's what we're hearing. Here's what you need to do differently. Here's our recommendation. And then they respond with, here's how we're going to respond to that recommendation. And it's an iterative process like that. So that to me was part of the excitement of this work, was that I could feel like, okay, maybe we actually can have an impact through this regular kind of feedback loop, as opposed to just coming in as those outside evaluators popping in and saying, thumbs up, thumbs down, whatever, I'm out. Like, we're really trying to be part of that process, which is the value of the work to me. So we hope to hear from those families, and we hope to hear from families that have a range of stories to tell. And that's, I mean, as you will know, that's one of the main privileges of working in this field, is that you do get to sit down and hear the families of the stories of families and of children who are living this, right? So
that's
yeah.
so unusual, because I guess, I mean,
Mm.
so often people assume that once the policy in place, the work is done.
Well, well, everybody here knows that is, you know, barely a beginning, and to have system-wide or province-wide change is, I mean, takes time, but it also takes concerted efforts and constant evaluation and feedback to be able to be paying attention to, like, even the, you know, the kinds of language that might be used in a department to say, like, how will we know if this is working? What could we even point to say, what would we expect to see in the system if this policy is actually, and to even have that kind of conversation to say to a teacher, what would your classroom look like if this policy has been implemented? To say to a principal, like, what would your school look like if this policy has been implemented? Those are conversations that often people haven't had at all until we speak to them, right? So it is a whole shift in many things that need to be looked at for that kind of broad scale change.
So I know
Right.
it's early days, but are you learning anything yet that you could share about how we keep this constantly flowing in terms of it being an iterative process and a kind of a living process in that way?
Yeah, we have what I would say is just a lovely, stunning report that is currently embargoed. So I look
Okay.
forward to, so those of you who are in deep in Nova Scotia politics know that there is a new premier, and there is also a new Minister of Education, you know, within the last 3 weeks. So, you know, many things, much work is continuing, and then many kind of public decisions are being put on hold a little bit for people to catch up. So, but honestly, I think a lot of what we've learned in that first year of the evaluation, I would say one of the big pieces is around that, what sometimes we call alignment. We probably should call it something more like cohesion. So if we're talking about inclusive education in this broad way, then if this part of the department, or if this part of the region, they have regions instead of school boards, but take it to mean the same kind of thing. If over here we have efforts focused on anti-racism and culturally responsive pedagogy, and here we have technology and assistive technology, and here we have literacy coaches, and here we have multi-tiered systems of support. If we have all of these little pieces happening at the same time, but when you go to a professional learning, you have to check one off or the other, and they don't come together in any cohesive way, then they don't come together in the minds of the teachers. They see them as something I do for this kid on Tuesday, I do this other kid, you know, this other thing. So then it doesn't actually advance with the goals of the policy, which are to have this kind of cohesive focus.
So how do you break through that?
Well, you know, part of what I've seen is, and part of what's fascinating, I can't tell you how much I wish I was in Nova Scotia this whole year. When we were there, you know, I would hear, as always, you know, there's those pockets of innovation where I talked to one person in Cape Breton, and she said, when we have PD, we always have, so that was the example. We always have, if we have a literacy coach, we would also always have the student services would always be there, and we would always have the technology people there at the same time. We plan it together, we offer it together. And in that way, it's always seen as, of course, these things all come together. So part of what's exciting about our work is that we can be that kind of outside to say, okay, here's this incredibly innovative practice happening in this region. And so we're trying to work with them to say, like, where are the opportunities for networking, really explicit networking, so that these can be shared. And actually some of the pandemic has really helped, you know, these urban or these rural areas where travel can be, you know, can take 3 days to get from one school to the next. Technology has actually really helped some of that networking. how can we share those? How can we scale them up, like all of those usual things? But they are always happening. But it's just how to share them, and how to find the ways to say it's regionally specific and it's locally developed and specific. And yes, that exact thing will only work there, but there's something similar that can work in your region with a different population, with a different set of circumstances. So that's part of what we're hoping to be able to shine light on for them.
Given that you're in Ontario, can I just ask you to think a little bit about what would be involved for Ontario to have a policy that has implications province-wide the way Nova Scotia does, and whether that is ever realistic, and whether it could be pursued in a province as large as Ontario with 72 school districts and such a variation in populations and in communities. So is anything similar even possible in Ontario?
I mean, I'd rather ask you that question than you ask me that question. You would know, you have the experience with that. But
well, my experience tells me that it would be very difficult.
I mean, and I hear this all the time, that size and scope, makes things quite challenging. The fact that in Nova Scotia we can get, the director of programs and student services, each one of them together in a single room around a boardroom table. But then there's other challenges there too that Ontario would have, lots of advantages and privileges that other jurisdictions wouldn't have. So it's if I think about the experiences that I've had in the different communities that I work with, I just find that, even within my own city of Ottawa, and you all know this, it's the scaling up that I always struggle with, because I could go to 3 different schools, and I could go to 2 different school boards. I have 4 within my neighborhood, and I could just see such an extraordinary range of practices happening with the same overarching policy in place. So that's why I think most of my work has focused on the individual students and the individual teachers and working with families, is because I do sometimes just feel pretty overwhelmed with the extraordinary complexity and size of a political system that's as huge as we have in Ontario. So I don't have a great answer.
What about the vision? What about the vision and sort of the leadership that the ministry in Nova Scotia played by developing and putting out their policy? Do you see that as being something that could happen in some of the larger provinces, most specifically Ontario?
I do, certainly. And honestly, I know there's specifics about the policy that might not be the same in every province, but
sure.
But there are certain elements that many provinces would have in common now. I mean, in Ontario, I think about Learning for All, that's from 2013, that would have key concepts of, we've got to lead with universal design for learning, we've got to lead with differentiated instruction. I evaluated the differentiated instruction professional learning strategy in Ontario years ago. And, actually shifting practice, particularly in secondary schools, to take on that approach of differentiated instruction is still so much in progress that it just seems like maybe in these systems,
that's a nice way to describe it.
But so maybe it's like a 2-decade cycle for us to see some of those. And again, in town, I mean, our local board, experiential learning, we've got teachers who are just running wild at the secondary schools, doing extraordinarily creative, inclusive things with experiential learning that fits beautifully within some of the UDL and DI approaches at the secondary level. So those are the things that keep me invested and going in the research, because I see those pockets. But when you do the large scale evaluations, it can be discouraging to see that big picture change, for sure.
So what else are you working at besides these two
Well,
project.
before we go on to something else, can we find out more about the research in Ontario or the guidelines that you're developing?
Oh,
in
sure.
distance learning, because I think one of the fears that a lot of people have internationally is that the move to distance learning during the pandemic could lead to more exclusion of learners with disabilities as they're encouraged to just stay home and learn online. And I'm just wondering if you can comment on the links between what you're learning about COVID and in terms of distance education and how to still promote inclusion.
So it's interesting that you mentioned like what I'm seeing, because we have a couple of dozen school boards so far that have already submitted their feedback, their learnings that are helping us to create the guide. So it's been really fascinating to hear about the school board experiences over this past year and what they've put in place. And I have to say, I see it's a very different conversation in a lot of the feedback I'm getting, which is like, here's all of the practices we had in place in segregated and specialized settings, and here's the stuff we were doing for everybody else. And I find that the approaches that I'm hearing from the boards are quite delineated in that way. So the segregated and the specialized settings, it's far more like we wanted to maintain those relationships. So we made sure that students were still attached to their home school or to their home teacher. Whereas if that wasn't the case, then oftentimes students were developing relationships out of kind of nowhere because they were attached to a virtual school or virtual classroom and not related. Same with like, specialized supports. Well, there might have been a learning resource teacher who was associated with the student for many years. If they're in a specialized or segregated setting, they can maintain that relationship. If not, then maybe there's someone who's specifically attached to the virtual school and they're developing relationship in that way. So I actually found that there are very different practices that were recommended or used depending on the placement or the program that the student was attached to. So that I found fascinating. The guide we're writing is not organized in that way. We're bringing in a lot of accessibility areas that aren't always at the top of mind for people, recognizing what actual accessibility looks like through technology. But I've also have like the whole first half of the document is universal design for learning and differentiated instruction. How do you build the community? How do you have participation in a range of different ways by students? So I actually have really extensive information, kind of tier one approach, that if this is really all going well for your virtual classroom, but then also really specific recommendations that would need to be in place for students to be able to actually be included and participate in these settings, which is actually a challenge for us, challenge we've seen over the past year for sure.
When will it be available? I want a copy now.
Well, so word is we submit it next Wednesday, and then the way that this works is that we provide it to the ministry, and then it's theirs. So it will, I'm sure, be changed in many ways and added to, things removed, etc. So as to when that actually might be released, I have no idea.
Thanks.
So if we think about the way our world has been for this last year, how much research out there is there on how we deal with remote learning for people with disabilities? I mean, it's such a thing that we're so dealing with now, but this report you're writing or this guide you're writing, it's amazing you're getting all this input from school boards, but is there research as well that's been done sort of systematically over the years to look at these issues, or is this something we really need to worry about?
It's a bit of both. So there definitely is research out there. There's Michigan Virtual, there's entirely virtual schools and courses, particularly in the US, that have gone on for decades, where they have entire approaches around how do you support students who would have various needs within that setting. Some of them have mentors who would be attached to the homeschool. So there's a whole range of practices that are already out there that people would point to say that really works well for this student. But we've also had conversations with some of those researchers who've been involved, and they they also talk about, for some students, whether it's a student who has any kind of identified disability or not, remote and virtual learning is just not going to be a great fit for everybody. And so my concern is always anything that's required raises issues. The same way that being kind of required to be physically present in school is challenging for some, being required to be online is also challenging for some. So I'm always just conscious of, if you don't have choice or flexibility in that, that's a problem. On the other hand, there's tons of evidence out there of practices that can be the most successful, but choice is one of them. The ability of the student to advocate, the how much time and effort has been put into preparing the student, their family, the teacher, in terms of having all of the skill set that's required to really navigate this whole world, in addition to the pedagogy and the climate creating and all of those other pieces. So there is a lot that goes into it, and we've heard a lot about how some people associate the online setting with cost savings, that this might save it. And that's problematic because it requires as much or more human support to have it work effectively online as it does for a student to be physically present in a classroom. So it's not going to cut out the people to have the virtual setting in place. So we have evidence, and also be worried.
Time is short. 30 minutes isn't a long chat. Can you just share, as we conclude here, something exciting and different that you're doing right now, that you'll be doing the next year or two that maybe we haven't talked about already?
Yeah, one of the partnerships that we have in place locally is with a number of mental health treatment centers for children and youth and access services. So we have there's a whole consortium here, which is incredibly well linked, that all of these, often separate systems have all come together to connect. And so we have applied for funding in a number of places to look at the issue of attendance. And we're defining it as attendance, recognizing that attendance can also mean participation in various ways. I am concerned about the systematic exclusion of students from schools. And then I have many colleagues who clinically work with one of the toughest populations they have, are school refusers. Students who, for whatever reason, home and school and everything in between, just so strongly feel that school is not a safe place for them to be, and lots of anxiety. And we are concerned that after the pandemic, all of these kids who've been at home for all of these months, not even developing, maybe those skills that they need to navigate the world and social life, that attendance is going to be on everybody's radar, and is really going to be something that we need to look at. So we have some partnership grants that we've applied for, and the school boards are involved to some extent, to look at this issue. How do communities and cultures understand attendance? What does attendance look like if you're in grade 9? What does that feel like? What do the numbers show? What are the rules in place with respect to how long a student can be, asked to come to school, or said that you could stay home with your family? So all of those complex pieces around attendance is something we're really interested in looking at in the next year or so. That's
great. That's something we'll certainly want to follow. A lot of interest in that.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate you being one of our associates in our network in Inclusive Education Canada. And I'll just remind people that before Christmas, you chaired a webinar for us, which we appreciate. And you bring such enthusiasm and clear thinking to what you speak about. We look forward to great things from you and your team in the future. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, everybody.